just like to introduce you to Sean Lynch, our current artist in residence at the model. And Sean has also created a piece of work called A Church Without a Steeple, which forms part of the exhibition here, Into the Light, which is part of a larger Arts Council exhibition throughout 4 galleries in Ireland. Sean has also exhibited at the Camden Arts Centre in London, at the Frankfurter Kunstverein in Frankfurt, Berlin, Catalyst Arts Centre in Belfast, and the Irish Museum of Modern Art. He's primarily a visual artist, but has curated projects, for example, A Rocky Road, which is an exhibition examining the history of modern art in Ireland at the Crawford Art Gallery in Cork. Books and publications also form part of his practice, and these can be found in the resource room here in the model as part of the exhibition Into the Light. Sean is interested in issues of place, architecture, and social history. His interest in the physical environment stems from a very early age. His father owned a garage situated in a village, a busy place of people arriving with their problems, with their cars, trucks, tractors, and it was a place that Sean called a theatre of the social. So his practice is very, very diverse, encompassing sculpture, photographs, installation, video work, text, film, and for me, I suppose, and from what I've seen of Sean's work, very, I think, significant and engaging public art projects. For example, Medjool and Darling, a public art project commissioned by the Dublin City Council, which was located on O'Connell Street and which showcased images and artefacts selected by Sean that evoke a variety of the city's artistic and social histories. Peregrine falcons, DeLorean car parks found at the bottom of the sea are just some of the elements which form part of Sean's work. The notional idea of a story and how it can be interpreted is often the itch which Sean needs to scratch to activate a project. So without further ado, I'd like you to welcome Sean Lynch.
Thanks, Marie-Louise. That was a very nice introduction, really appreciated it. I came last week to the model and having a great time in Sligo, and I don't particularly know a lot of the region here, so I'm very excited to be here for the month, and I'm really enjoying myself. Let me think how to start. Okay. So what I would like to do today is, you kind of covered pretty much everything I have to say there. So the rest of the talk will sound like a diluted version of what you've said. A lot of the projects I make, I did sculpture as a BA, and I got a BA degree in sculpture when I went to art college. I did a master's in the history of art then in the University of Limerick, and then kind of bummed around the place for a few years and ended up in Frankfurt, in Steeple in Frankfurt, which is a very small art college bang in the middle of the city of Frankfurt, and it was a real eye-opener for me because there was a lot of conceptually led practices that I was exposed to that I never had come across in Ireland or even in the Anglo-sized world. And it was a very intense time. We were there from 2005 to 2007. And I've been making projects, I guess, ever since that reflected some of the ethos or some of the thinking that I had come across at that time. And in general, these are project by project. This is the basis of them. And in general, there's a certain sense of investigation or a process of investigation going on, and that tends to in some way be reflected in the final outcome of the artwork. And that's certainly the case in the work that was made for the model here, which I've been kind of working on for about 10 weeks since the end of the summertime. And it's a slide projection piece. It's 16 minutes long. It has a voiceover synchronized to the slides, so each time you look at the slides, There's some information being imparted by a narrator. And it had, I suppose, an idea nearly as a drift. And what I mean by this is the images you see, they drift around Ireland in some way, meandering around the place, I guess you could say. So it goes from architecture school in Limerick to a destroyed Louis Le Brocq mural of the 1950s, to a church in North Kerry in Knocknewar, and along with that, the storeroom here, the art storeroom in the model. And the idea of the piece, in many ways is to take these images and juxtapose text or a script or material against them, to kind of call into doubt what exactly these places are in some way. And it's just a certain way of opening up spaces or possible ways of investigating things that immediately might seem a closed situation or a narrative that has been told over and over again, that there might be some other way of reading this or opening it up, that both for my activities and for an audience who would encounter the artwork, that we could share this experience together. It's kind of a bit airy-fairy, but what I would like to do in the next half hour, maybe this idea will become a little more manifest. Please stop me along the way if you have any questions, because I tend to find that there'll be a lot of contextual material and if, buts and maybes presented on my behalf, and it's actually really good that you can pull me up and go, hey, hang on kid, what's going on there, or what's been said, all right? The first image I'm showing here is from a Ernest Gombrich book. It's a really, really important image for me. And I just wanted to touch on two, suppose, processes of thinking that I've certainly picked up on in the last couple of years. This is called the Pasquino. And what you're looking at here is an etching from around the 14th century in Rome. And this is around the time that the statues of ancient Rome are beginning to be dug up out of the ground again and being placed on street corners. And it became a kind of folkloric, a folklore tradition where the general public would come along to these statues and attach pieces of graffiti or notes in their vicinity, with this idea that the statue in some way was speaking about this contemporary situation or topical issues of the day, because this statue had been around for 2,000 years. It's seen everything going on. Even in the ground, it could feel things happening. And when it arrived again and came out of the subterranean place it was in, it could again comment on these things. And I'm very interested in this idea that you could take something and in some way attach these notes onto it, or attach different contexts onto it, an already given situation where it becomes alive or becomes at play once more. I'm going to give a really practical example of this. This is early April 2008 in MAVIS. It's a social housing project outside of Limerick City. There's 1,160 houses were built in the late 1970s and early 1980s. No civic infrastructure was put in at the time. There's 13 individual parks there, and in some way then we all know the story and how this plays out in terms of social disenfranchisement and an understanding of the area as a no-go zone. And I have friends who live very close to the housing estate, and I'm very aware of the area. And I became very interested in how this area was represented visually. The predominant mode of this was photojournalism. Journalists would go down to the housing estate, look for the dodgiest looking boarded up building they could find at the very, very back of the estate, take a photograph of that, and that would appear in the newspaper. And that seemed to be the only mode of how the area was represented. And I actually thought, well, is there some way of evoking something outside of that system, or some way of understanding a different way of working through the site and the place and giving a different representation, and how would you go about that? Now, the second model I want to evoke along with the Pasquino, which is quite important here, is the story of Sweeney, and this kind of gets back to some of my ideas around drift. Sweeney was a king in northwest Ulster, a pagan king. His neighbour Ronan became Bishop Ronan, and he built a church. Ronan would get up very early every morning and ring the church bell, calling everybody to prayer. Sweeney did not enjoy this. He was like the lion there in the morning time. Suddenly his neighbour was calling him to prayer, so he dragged Ronan out of the bell tower one day, dug a hole, and was burying Ronan alive in the hole to conclude this and have his lions. And sure, the next thing, he got the call for battle, so he had to run away to battle straight away. Ronan dug himself out of the hole, remembered some of his pagan tricks, and cursed Sweeney to be half man, half bird. And instantaneously on the battlefield, he began to levitate, and he became half man, half bird. And the story is very well known. Seamus Heaney has dealt with the laments as Sweeney wandered around the place. It features very prominently in At Swim Two Birds as well. It was a big topic in Limerick, where I had my initial art education. In the 1980s, a lot of artists picked up on it as an interest in terms of the prominence of neo-expressionism and a return to the figure. It was quite a challenge to paint half man, half bird Sweeney. A very interesting topic. Had he a beak? Would you put wings on him? Has he claws on the bottom of his legs? Perfect material, really important. And a lot of artists in Limerick dealt with it in very, very interesting ways. But as a model, I think it's, and it's very serious on my behalf, as a model of thinking, this idea of half man, half bird drifting throughout the island here. Went over to Wales for a while as well, and then came back to Ireland. Always uncomfortable, not being able to settle in the one place. The other birds wouldn't take much attention to him. They'd always go away because he was half man. Couldn't be taken very seriously by humanity because he was half bird. So this interim situation that he existed in was quite fascinating for me. So maybe and the image you're looking at here is a peregrine falcon. There were political victims in Ireland in the 1920s when they started to assemble the Protected Birds Act in the government at the time. All the songbirds got onto that list, and they were protected by the Free State or whatnot. Peregrine falcons were not put on the list because they were considered a bird of the ascendancy in regards to falconry in the country. However, the falcons have been here for thousands of years, yet they in some way did not get this access. The government did not accept them as so. You fast forward onto the 1960s, you have DDT insecticides on the land. The peregrine falcons, their eggs were too thin to nourish the chicks. And their population was down. It's recorded as being only 60 mating falcons in Ireland in 1969. However, that situation has improved, and I was very interested in this process of how birds or animals are for example, the eagle in Donegal, how it's reintroduced back into a particular place and all that goes with it. So I worked for 5 months in my Ross developing a project that I could reintroduce the peregrine falcon directly into my Ross. And in some way, I will present maybe a 3-minute video that was the outcome of that process, and then I can talk a little bit about what kind of happens when you take an idea and you start mapping it out on a day-to-day basis, and the avenues that can occur, or the investigations or encounters that are generated through that process. I'll stop talking for maybe a minute and a half, and then I'll begin again, because I have a lot of things I would like to tell you today, okay? One of the things that really annoys me when people see this video, first of all, is they always tell me there should be like the Flight of the Valkyries or some sort of classical music on it. I always have to explain it's difficult enough to attach a camera onto a peregrine falcon, let alone a microphone or a sound system. There you see a crow attacking the falcon. It was the first time that's been recorded by anybody. They were the crows in Limerick were territorially taken by the falcons there. Another issue with the skies in the city, and this kind of comes back to Evoke Sweeney at the end of the story. In 2008, there was 23 racing pigeon coops in backyards in my Ross. Peregrine falcons are considered the antichrist of the racing pigeon community, because a pigeon might go, say, from Glasgow all the way to Limerick or to Sligo and fly that distance, and if they don't arrive, there's a tendency to blame it on a peregrine falcon, who they can fly up to 250 miles an hour. They're the fastest creature in the world, and they would just smash off the pigeon and eat him when he landed on the ground. It was quite a hard sell to ask 23 racing pigeon coops how they would react if there was 3 peregrine falcons being reintroduced into the neighbourhood. So a timetable was drawn up for the sky. It was coming up to racing pigeon season in April time. So, you know, they'd be keen to have the birds out and flying around the place a good few hours of the day there. So I was granted the skies over the housing estate from 8 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. There'll be a neutral time between 2 and 3 o'clock, and then the racing pigeons then could enjoy the rest of the evening carefree without any falcons to attack them. This was fine and dandy until I realised the peregrine falcons don't actually really fly before 11 a.m. in the morning. They do have a bit of Sweeney in them, and they refuse to be getting up early and respecting the hierarchy of Catholicism in one sense. So these situations in some way become almost those notes that you see in the image of the Pasquino. They become evoked, or they can be communicated throughout the area, or particularly in my Ross, for example. So a lot of the time the birds would fly away, and people would, the area has it's typical garden city in one sense, where you have these parks, and then, as you can see from the video, these quite large green areas in between all of the parks. In 2008, they decided to spend €6.5 billion to knock the entire amount of the houses and condense this garden city into something that was spatially a lot more compact, because urban strategists believed this would be easier to manage. And in some sense, the reintroduction of the falcons there was a political gesture in terms of realizing actually this is the ecology of the area. It just, you actually have to work with what you have rather than imagining you scrape everything away and begin again. That's always the issue of progress and history, and that in many ways is a theme in a lot of my work. Following the period of time and the production of the piece, 1,100 DVDs were made, and one was sent to every house in the estate. And everybody in some way would connect, or the idea was people connected a lot with the video, both in terms of the process, where they would encounter us with a big radar dish and 3 peregrine falcons going around the neighbourhood for a week. And in addition, in terms of almost an afterthought, the video in some ways an afterthought, but a lot of people could specifically look at it and see their houses or see different areas. And I suppose I should return to my objective at the start about trying to generate a different kind of visuality of the area, and that was the intent. As nowadays the piece is also shown in art galleries as a projection in a darkened space, and that becomes another way of disseminating it along with this engagement with the site in MAVIS. Needless to say, the €6.5 billion redevelopment is not going to occur now. At the time, a lot of people were really concerned about it there. They had set up an office, and many people didn't know what was going to happen to them when their houses were knocked. There was no clear plan about the rehousing at the time. So there was a lot of anxiety spatially around the area that the piece in some way becomes imbued into, depending on in some way, entrance points, the relationship that you might have had with the piece, how it was encountered. So this not only happens in gallery scenarios, but on the street there, or in some way also as a story. Somebody introduces peregrine falcons into the area. They typically get reintroduced into the wild. There's a certain linguistic play about MAVIS being a wild neighborhood, you know. So anyway, I could kind of go on in this way, but in terms of clarity of time, I'll stop talking and move on to the next project. Right. What I'm going to do is maybe spend about 25 minutes explaining why I took this photograph and the reasons behind taking this particular image. This is an image of a swimming crab sitting up on top of a big lump of cast iron in about 18 metres below the surface in Galway Bay, below the water surface in Galway Bay. The photograph was taken in July 2009 and in some way was imbued into an investigative path I had taken for about 7 months before that, revolving around the DeLorean car. My very dear friend Carl, when I showed him the photograph, he looked at it and he said to me, "Sean, that's a very good photograph now." I said, "Thanks, Carl, appreciate your compliment there." And he says, "There's just one problem with it." I said, "Oh, what's the problem?" And he said, "Well, you never got rid of the red eye." Many of you already know this story. This is a particular press image or promotional image that was used for the DeLorean motor car company. Culturally, the car was produced, 7,000 of these cars were produced in Dunmurry outside Belfast between 1981 and 1982. John DeLorean came here. He had 3 options to put the plant in 3 different places. One was in Limerick, one was in Puerto Rico, the other one was in Dunmurry. Desi O'Malley, later the leader of the Progressive Democrats, pulled the plug on it being in the Republic of Ireland at the last moment, and the investments from the UK and from the Labour government there at the time resulted in a factory being built, a very large factory in Dunmurry. 2,500 workers were trained up from scratch, where the city had virtually no history in terms of car making before, and these cars were produced. The first shipment went to Los Angeles. They realized there was a problem with the steering of the car, and they couldn't be sold. A lot of cash flow problems occurred for DeLorean until it got to the situation where there was an entrapment process by the FBI in the Sheraton Lorena Hotel on the evening of October the 24th, 1982, where he was dealing cocaine. And I suppose the urban myth that we would all like to believe is that the money from the cocaine was being used to pay the factory workers' wages in Belfast. And these pieces of economy, or these quite tedious at first links, are something that particularly interests me. And you'll see this played out in terms of some of the photographs and some of the sculptures that I'll present around this project. Culturally, the car has been very noted, of course. DeLorean made it out of stainless steel. The outside, the panels you see here on the outside are unpainted stainless steel. The idea was the car would never rust. It would last forever. It would never become obsolete. So this is the utopian car, if you want to view it like that. D.A. Pennybaker made a film about it in 1981. The gallery here also sponsored Duncan Campbell to make a project about it a few years ago. It's in Back to the Future. Nike now make DeLorean runners. So it's in some way, there is a history there, or people recognize it in some way or other. I'm particularly interested in this photograph and the way that the three people in the background don't even see the Learjet. They're looking very, very specifically at the back of the car. Now, I suppose to put it in context a little bit, my interest in it derived from the time growing up in a garage, I guess. And in the evening time, my father would take me in his van to local scrapyards around Cork, Kerry, Clare and Tipperary, looking for spare parts. He used to fix a lot of tractors and a lot of trucks, and so he'd be getting the spare parts for the following morning. Needless to say, I was bored off my nut as a kid, sitting in the van as he disappeared up off a scrapyard for hours on end with some chap. But I do have quite important recollections in one sense years later. One of the things that I guess noted at the time was the ever-present sound of a barking dog in these scrapyards. There would also be a very large puddle of water. On the driest day of the year, there'd be a very large puddle of water at the front gate of the scrapyard, of indeterminable depth as well, to keep any lad with a suit out. So I kind of became interested in these places that, and especially there would always be this a man in the yard who had an encyclopedic knowledge of where everything was. And the thing that really interested me was the specificness of that scrap isn't just simply scrap. It's material that has come from different places that had a function already. And to in some way acknowledge that or be articulate of that fact was something I became really interested in my thoughts, maybe circa 2005, 2006. And so I started investigating in a very open-ended manner, having some small little archival tidbits, I suppose, to get me so far in this process. And I'm going to detail this particular journey now for you. The images that you see here are taken in Hellbronn, in the Lapel factory in Hellbronn. It's in Germany, in Western Germany. They were subcontracted by DeLorean. They had a plant in Carlow at the time, and they were subcontracted by DeLorean to produce the stainless steel sections for the car that would live forever. These are the molds that you see here. You'd put a piece of stainless steel in between, and the molds come down, they go, push, and the next thing they shape the exterior panels of the car. When the cash flow problem happened, the factory closed, bankruptcy was declared, Lapel were owed a lot of money. So what you see here is a lot of molds that were used predominantly for Ford cars in recent years, and these are the master molds for producing these cars, which are in some way, when you think about it, formerly in the world, the shape of cars is very predominant in the public realm. You could say that they're maybe after buildings and the shapes of buildings, on a very cursory level, the shapes of cars come next. Maybe us as living entities come third. I'm not so sure. We can argue this out a little later on. Lapel had no more use for these large pieces of metal. Nobody else was making a DeLorean car with those particular gull wing door shapes. What you're looking at here are a series of interlinked photographs that were exhibited in the gallery I work with in Dublin in early 2010. And you can see in terms of presentation how this works. Each of the images have a text panel relating to them along the wall there. And this is this is a very economic, I suppose, a chain of handling in some way or other. And I'm going to detail the journey that was made to a series of sites that were related to the physical dismantling of the DeLorean manufacturing process. The first image is to make a visit to Dunmurry, to the factory that was where the car was assembled. It's a kind of a bit of a dumb thing to do. I think there's a great value in sometimes in being deliberately dumb as well. It's, you know, revisiting somewhere 25 years later, when you know very well they're not making the car there anymore, but going there anyway just in case there might have been something there. You know, in terms of, I suppose, the kind of notion of how things are streamlined nowadays, or how you have to be in the right place at the right time, there actually can be a really great value in being in the completely wrong place at a very inappropriate time, because it opens up certain other things, that certain other avenues or ways of thought that might be possible outside of the hierarchies that we encounter today. Now, I'm not saying this photograph is a deliberate representation of that, but it's like a working method. You can apply this method in situations sometimes, with mixed results, of course, but this is something I would hold close as a process of working. And maybe a better example about this would be that this is one of the scrap yards. It was formerly the site of the Hammond Lane scrapyard, which took a lot of these very large pieces of metal that were used to stamp out the shape of the car and anything else they could find in Lapel and Carlow that was DeLorean related. All this stuff was so heavy that several scrapyards became involved in coming there, loading up their trucks and dispersing this material to their scrapyards with the intention they would then be put on a boat, sent to Spain, sent to Portugal, sent to British Steel in Sheffield and in Kent to be melted down, and this material would become something else again. It would have a life outside of DeLorean. It no longer made DeLorean the car that lasted forever. Instead, it becomes part of a building down in Canary Wharf 5 years later. Of course, my thinking around this notion of the molecular theory comes from Flann O'Brien and the Third Policeman. Should I enact a little scene, or huh? Okay. The very beautiful evocation around the bicycle, where a person cycles their bike for 10 years and an hour every day. The atoms from the person goes into the bicycle, and the atoms from the bicycle gets communicated up through the saddle into the person until you have someone who might be 40 or 50% bicycle. In many ways, Merleau-Ponty was pointing towards some of these ideas 15 years later, after Flann O'Brien wrote The Third Policeman. of course, it's not very obvious. Nobody is sprouting handlebars or the like, but the gesture I always remember is when somebody comes into the room. They have to lean against the wall like this to stay upright, or they move in a circle very gradually to stay standing. So this is a tremendous idea to bargain with the public realm, the flesh of the world, that everything is touching something else, that's touching something else, that's touching everything. We're all connected physically at the one time. And so I guess my use value for an idea like this is to say I can put that in my toolbox of things that I can apply to different situations. So when I look at this particular image here, the scrapyard is gone from the site. It's no longer there. It relocated in the late 1990s. The site is now known predominantly as being the possible location of U2's skyscraper on the Docklands in Dublin. Another failed plan in many ways. But through a degree of research and talking to people who are in the scrapyard now and asking them did they remember anything about this DeLorean material coming through their scrapyard for a few days in the mid-1980s, circa end of 1983, start of 1984, they did remember the material because everybody knew what the DeLorean story was at the time. And secondly, it was very, very heavy. Heavier than a lot of the other material in the yard. So if I want to throw a Flann O'Brien filter over this image and suggest that there's a few atoms of DeLorean sitting somewhere in that yard because it was holed up there for 2 or 3 days before it got a boat over to Kent to be melted down and appear in Canary Wharf, this would be the logic that I would think about a lot. Again, this in some way is my haystack, my Monet haystack. And this is a scrapyard outside of Cork. And I would like to think that this material is about to be exported. Where were they exporting to? They were still exporting to Portugal in 2009. So I imagine that this pile of scrap is the same pile of scrap as 1985 because one little piece gets left on the ground in 1985. It just builds up again. This pile of scrap keeps building up, goes out again. Another little piece might be left in the yard. So I'm interested in that evocation in many ways and the materiality of what it suggests. I talked to the gentleman in the scrapyard here. Also, they remembered the DeLorean material, and they were able to inform me of a possible link of where they thought it was. I went through a lot of newspapers at the time. Several journalists were covering this story. There was also DeLorean had hired a former CIA agent called Gordon Novell to make the same trip that I was making 25 years later because he believed there might be this possibility that some of these master molds for the DeLorean car might have survived and didn't go to the steel furnaces around Europe to be materialized into the next economic, their next use in terms of economy, architecture, manufacturing. Anyway, all of this is coming together in some way or other and becomes reflected on this chain of handling. You see these two factories on the left-hand side, then the series of scrapyards or former sites of scrapyards in Cork, Galway and Dublin. Then you come across a boat that I found underneath at Charles Brunel Bridge in Bristol. This boat was used to remove some pieces of these master molds from the scrapyard in Cork sometime in late 1983, early 1984. It sailed these pieces all the way up the west coast of Ireland to Galway Bay to this particular fish farm that was being assembled there at the time. The fish farm now is fallow, it's not used. Mainly because of the quite stringent EU regulations around fish quotas. this site can accommodate 150,000 salmon in relatively luxurious stocking conditions compared to, say, Norway that would be outside of the European Union. So they're quite well cared for as it goes if you were a salmon in a fish farm. We arrived on the site in the knowledge that there might be this possibility that these master presses for the DeLorean were being used as anchors on this fish farm to hold the fish farm in place, because they were so heavy. They're all between 5 and 25 tons each, depending on what part of the car they were making. A lot of negotiations with the fish farm owners occurred, mainly around how to actually frame this activity. The typical situation in many ways is if someone starts knocking on your door going, "Can I have a look at what you have?" They tend to think it might have an inherent economic value. Anyway, later that afternoon, the divers went down 18 meters below. 12 pieces, they bought 12 pieces from the scrapyard. There's 3 pieces remaining jutting up out of the seabed on that site. The Atlantic breezes come along and sweep the bottom of the seabed clean on a regular basis, storms coming in from the west. So you can see, for example, in the right-hand side of the image, the aquarium-like pebbles that are in there. And what you're looking at is the swimming crab who now lives inside these DeLorean body moldings. So the metal has been obscured by this ecosystem of what is called seaweed there, or kind of coral there. Here's another image of another one of the dies. I'm going to go into punning mode now. One of the things that I was, and of course I have no qualification or ability to do deep sea diving. I had to send divers down on that site. The other reason is you plug into certain local infrastructures, as you can see also with the peregrine falcon work. This is part of the process, is engaging with already what's there and understanding already what's there. So these chaps, they are already involved in doing a lot of dives around that area for biodiversity studies, and they already know the guys who own the fish farm. So there's a sense of trust already inherent there, rather than me arriving like some sort of Antarctic explorer or putting up a flag or something like this, you know. So this has to be done very subtly, of course, and you know, sometimes it's successful and other times you get sent on your way back up the yard. Here's the front of the car, the bonnet of the car, if you can imagine that, with a few crabs underneath the hood. Here's the passenger sitting in the front seat of the moulding of the car. In this image it becomes a little more visually apparent that you can see some of the metal pieces here in front of the swimming crab a lot more, or he's not a swimming crab, it's just a regular crab. And here is the lobster, who now lives in one of the moulding crevasses on another mould, which was about 5-6 meters away from the other two I've shown you. The very interesting thing for me about this situation is one of the people who have always been very important for me in terms of trying to get a handle on how to make art and present art and try and nourish audiences with this process is Linda Nochlin, and she wrote a book in 1972 called Realism. And it really got me back into the Impressionists again, and talking about how they framed things and their understanding of what they saw in front of them. So immediately when you see this image, it doesn't really tell you very much. There's a crab crawling out of what looks like some sort of makeshift home for him. Might be a wheelbarrow, who knows. and upside down wheelbarrow. You know, these stories, the crabs grow to the size, or lobsters grow to the size of their homes and where they live. So many times down in the bottom, you'll meet a lobster who's the size of a wheelbarrow, because that's what he's living in, turned upside down. This particular crab now, he inherits the DeLorean legacy. He will grow to be the size of that DeLorean car part. Again, I hope it becomes obvious in some way. I don't mean obvious. I hope it becomes apparent in some way about how how information is transmitted through this investigative process. In terms of the gallery, there becomes a publication that is revised on each presentation, because sometimes new knowledge about this comes to light, or you might meet someone who saw the photograph who actually knows loads about lobsters, and you have a chat with them and you can apply it back into the research. And this becomes a way for me not to become an authority on this. The last thing I want to do is be presenting very clinically observed lectures on this material, saying, look, I know all this stuff. That's not particularly interesting. What I'm kind of interested in, what I am interested in, is presenting it in a very public way, where the research process becomes part of that. Here's some of the gallery setups, and I'll get to this in a moment, but to give a very good example, in this process of identifying this lobster at the bottom of the Atlantic, who is living in a DeLorean car dye, I would have had and worked a lot with an enthusiastic car owners club, the DeLorean Car Owners Club of Ireland, and I was invited to go to Eurofest 2011, which is every 5 years. All the DeLorean owners of the world come to Belfast, and they rent out the Europa Hotel for the weekend, and they have a jamboree of all things DeLorean. And so I was asked to present the opening remarks or whatever in front of this audience, and a very genuine group. Certainly challenged the assumption that the love and joy of cars is a male-dominated thing. A lot of families were there, and I presented to about 250 people in the ballroom. Needless to say, my art speak, or the language that I would use in a scenario like that, sure, I couldn't be talking about art. I had to hit hard facts. You know, this is the material, this is the economic handling. So a good lesson for me in that regard. And I talked about this rumour that I had heard, which has been developed here in the last couple of weeks. This rumour about somebody went to one of these scrap yards in the 1980s and took some stainless steel that was used, or had intentions of being shaped into a DeLorean DMC-12 car. And they took it out of the scrapyard, they brought it home, and instead they made this steel into pig troughs. And they made 5 pig troughs out of it, and they have them on a pig farm. And I thought, well, okay, that's pretty incidental, or that's trivia in one sense. And that's how most of those stories are considered. It's like the kind of the annoying story you hear off of some lad in the pub after a few pints. You know, it doesn't really have a framework to back it up. It could be true. It might. It probably isn't. So how do you kind of deal with something like that? So I said I'd presented as part of my talk that this was a story that I had heard. And I came down off the stage then, and this lad came over to me and said, "You were on about those pig troughs there." I was. I'm the guy who owns those pig troughs. I have them on a pig farm in Cavan. And on Saturday I go to see them now, when I'm here on the residency. And I'm quite serious about this in terms of the whole framework, or how you go about constructing things from a material base, is something that interests me a lot. And in this way, you take as given what's in front of you in many cases. And in some way, I would like to imagine that this story or these images of these pig troughs, when I see them on Saturday, that they began this line of thinking to become a sports car in Beverly Hills, and they end up as a pig trough in County Cavan. The framework that has been put in place through my research in some way might be able to magnify this particular chain of handling as something important in terms of how an audience might view it. So that's my way of dealing with this. It's also fine to say it's completely incidental, and this is incidental research, and it's the Duchampian smoke off a cigarette idea, you know. If someone smokes, there's smoke coming off the cigarette, that's just smoke off the cigarette, you know. It's pretty incidental. So there's certain, again, these are kind of things that you keep close to you when you are trying to figure out what to say to someone on a fish farm, or when you're dealing with peregrine falcons, or all these different encounters that exist. This is the vocabulary that in some ways is clogging away in here to try and contextualize things in an artistic sense. Right, so all this knowledge, what do you do with it? You know, the idea, a very dumb idea at the time, was to get a barge, go to the fish farm, pay the guys off some money, take these large lumps of metal up out of the sea and make one last DeLorean car from it. And this in some way would become a cycle of this idea. We couldn't afford it at the time to do it. The second thing was I was actually really uncomfortable about trying to reactivate a manufacturing process that had already occurred and had in some way gone to some sort of conclusion, a logical one in one sense, but a hidden one. So I said, okay, well, let's take all this information and transpose it to now. And I'm not going to spend millions of dollars making these body presses. I can't afford to do that. So let's actually hammer a DeLorean car out with a hammer. Let's make these shapes in this manner and panel beat them into some sort of shape. We know from the start we'll never succeed. So we've got the whole success thing obliterated straight away. It will be an unmitigated disaster. We will run out of money and never finish the car. In some way it will reflect what already happened 25 years ago, but it exists as a shadow of that, I guess. Or how you kind of take this lump of industrial heritage and move it into another place of activity, and how this can play out. And so what you're looking at here is one of the presentations, and because this is a quite large body of work, it's 20 photographs, it's up on 10, 15 sculptures now. There's a publication that's revised according to meeting someone from the pig farm and all this sort of stuff. Sometimes it's presented as an entire installation. Other times just small snippets are presented, and the wall labels are rewritten depending on how it's presented. So again, it's like an idea where you decide, where there's a decision made that this isn't the full story. There's no attempt at wholesome didactic presentation. It's always a partial thing. There's always more information there to be got at and to be found. These are some of the photographs of the car being produced by hand in Enniscorthy in Wexford. I worked very close, and this is another reason to get to know people, I guess. I worked with a man called Neil Mackenzie, and we worked very closely together on a lot of projects since. And it was kind of a hard call to say to him, can you bash out a DeLorean car by hand with your hammer and English wheel? So this is the process of doing so, and welding it together and crimping it and running through in this manner. If these pieces were ever attached to the DeLorean car itself, they'd be bent into shape. They wouldn't look quite right, but that's kind of the idea. You know, they oscillate between being a sculpture, being something that looks like a replica, possibly being an original part. They're made out of stainless steel, the same as the original material of the panels of the car. So I haven't gone on so much today about how I work in gallery spaces, but there's a certain idea I like to use in terms of photography and sculpture, which is in some way the car jumps out of the photograph onto the gallery floor, and vice versa. The sculpture in some way seems intrinsically related to the piece of photo documentation of the process in terms of the production of the car. So you can see even just we had a great fun putting the concrete blocks underneath the car and having a laugh about the wheels being stolen, you know. So again, there'd always be an attempt to put in certain pun-related material and fond of puns. And the boot of the car exists as some sort of abstract minimal sculpture in the space. I suppose this is maybe the last image I will put on in regards to the piece, and it's a visual correlation between the legs of the swimming crab and the gull-wing doors of the car. And I'm a strong believer in I suppose the notion of visual literacy, and that the crab kind of looks a bit like a DeLorean in this light, you know, and he's sitting on this body of material that gave birth to DeLorean, if you want to put it in those ways, 25 years later. And so it was quite a kick for me to go to that much bother, going down and negotiating, getting to that fish farm, then to find this relationship that in some way could evoke a reading visually more than anything else, because a lot of the time it's context with my work. So that was something for me. How am I doing on time? Oh, okay, that's good. Okay. I'd like to present, kind of pull back from the intensity of that piece a little bit. Yes. Good man, Ronnie. Yeah. Yeah. Well, to be frank, it's a real makeshift idea. I kind of like the fact that it has it's not how could I put it? It wouldn't necessarily be a Ruskinian issue, you know, where it's presented in terms of a sense of propaganda that the handmade is superior to the industrial, or there's more attention given to it, and it's sure they're bleeding, they're bleeding that work, there's sweat in it. So it's actually really a makeshift scenario to say what are the possible relationships that might be evoked by doing something that essentially is kind of a project that's bound to fail in itself. Yeah. 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 Um, I don't think anything is ever a misreading. I guess it comes to whatever entry point you have to the piece, and because there's I suppose a sense of laterally there's a lot of places you can enter that particular work, and it's the largest piece I've made, and it's a quite sprawling piece in that sense. So there's always blind spots that you can end up in terms of its interpretation, and they're actually really. But this is why, in some way, I'm so keen to. I wouldn't say deny authorship of the piece, but be aware of it. It's never closed down, and the gesture of, and for me as well, sometimes it's a case of actually rereading the piece retrogressively, where I actually have to come to terms with what was done 2 or 3 years ago with the piece and figure what that actually is, you know? That you're following a certain understanding at the time, but you still haven't actually built up the context to know what it is yourself. And I'm the guy making it, supposedly, you know? So those kind of blind spots or those situations, or even the conversation here now, in some way feeds back into it. And then, you know, it becomes another area to pursue. And another way of understanding these issues around the public realm. I don't mean that as a catch-all thing, but that's just, again, like when you take really specific information, such as what was imparted there in the last 20 minutes or something, and then you start generalizing it again, that can be a useful activity, because then you can go and zoom back in on what is there already, and it might mean something else, like, you know. Mind you, I am big into Ruskin. So I have to, and I haven't really thought of him in regards to this work very much. So that might be a useful thing. The next show I will make revolves around 2 brothers from Ballyhooly in Cork, called John and James O'Shea. And the story was a local architect in Cork found them sometime during the famine down the bottom of a bohereen, carving away at a piece of timber. They were geniuses. 25 years later, they were working for Ruskin, carving in Oxford. And there's a lot of intently political implications in their story that isn't simply naive craftsmanship. So that's a certain area. Yeah. How are you? My real take, and I would kind of go back to the makeshift aspect of going from one situation to another, which tends to be done by association, you know, looking at a scrapyard and saying that's where the DeLorean stuff was, or whatever the case may be. Actually, I know very little about philosophy. I dip in and out of it, and try to use it in some way to get to the next place. But it would be your first iteration there. But yeah, I mean, a lot of this process or this work is predicated on an idea that when a story, I guess, or a history is repeated over and over and over again in conversation or in terms of whatever, maybe academic study or in the newspapers, it tends to reduce itself to an essence or a very particular narrative, and certain nuances that might make that story different from another can get lost along the way. I suppose a nice way of explaining it is I'd be a right divil for looking at the footnotes on an essay before reading the essay, you know, because that's the material, the awkward material that couldn't quite get into the main text sometimes, you know, that has a kind of quality to itself in terms of the assimilation of knowledge. It's just awkward, you know. It's like it didn't quite fit in, but it's some, like the author really felt as if maybe it should be there, so they throw it in the footnotes, you know. And so it is a case of rereadings and opening up that to speculation again, and knowing very well that you can rupture a bit of an understanding, or things could move along in a certain way, but that doesn't have to be done in terms of it being a dictatorial action. Yeah, and for me, one of the reasons to cite that within a visual art idiom is I think there's an incredible possibilities about how liberal you can be with visual art compared to a lot of other situations. I would never want to write history books about this stuff, because then the book is made, that's the first edition. You never have the chance to constantly revise the material and go back to the material. Whereas, you know, you can do a show every month if you want, if you're making art, and you can change the show every month. Yeah. Yes. I agree. The same as every other lad, we finished the project, and it was presented in the library there for 4 months, so people could see it in the library every day as well. It was disseminated on the internet along with Reddit as well. So there was no attempt to do that, but we didn't get to a screening simply because we couldn't find a decent wall in the neighbourhood to screen it on. And secondly, I ran out of money on the budget and couldn't afford one of those fancy damn projectors that they want for outside projection. So, you know, it's again, I don't mean it as a catch-all for these situations, but you kind of live and learn, or you kind of have your makeshift qualities to it, you know, so it keeps going in that way. Yeah, yeah. It is, yeah. One of the, and actually, if it's okay, I'll move this question onto the piece that's here in the model, the slide projection work. One of the really key texts for me in terms of how art operates in this country around these discussions was done by Tom Duddy. He was a lecturer in NUI Galway who became involved in art criticism predominantly in the Circa magazine in the 1980s. He wrote a text in 1987 called Irish Art Criticism, a Provincialisation of the Right. And he came across, and if it's okay, I'll surmise it a little bit. And we were talking about making it accessible, I think, as part of the show, that people could be directed to the text. It's really, really crucial piece of writing. And essentially, he picked up on a show called The Delighted Eye that was curated by a lady called Frances Ruan, and it was shown, I think, in London, maybe also in the Hugh Lane in the late 1980s. And she had argued in the catalogue text that here in Ireland there was something very, very special about the painters. A lot more special than in New York, for example, or in the likes of Paris, because here, in some sense, the mysticism could be evoked a lot clearer in terms of abstraction, you know? You look at a Patrick Collins, you look at a painting of High Brazil, the Jack B. Yeats here, for example. And this mysticism was a great thing for this country to have. You know, we could look at that fog all day long and engage with it, and sometimes things look as if they might come out of it, and then other times they go back in again. And this was a superior way of thinking compared to the likes of Barnett Newman over in New York, or where their hard lines, there was just an intensity to it that was why would you want to go straight to your destination when you could zigzag through the Irish fog, I think was generally what was being said. Anyway, she spoke about this as a very beneficial thing, and Duddy took the argument apart, and he came from a school of Marxism, and he said, well, you know, if you continue to propagate the notion of that fog, you'll never get through to any kind of socialist understanding, because actually you have to work in the landscape. A lot of these, the two projects I've shown are really, they're derived from this text. It's a really important text for me. You actually have to work your way through the landscape. You have to look at the specifics of this particular place. And that's the only way things are going to move on. And that's the only way an issue such as class in this country can actually be taken on in any way. If you continue to propagate that cloud, no one can see each other for dust, you know? And so in that sense, I have a particular interest in it. And I mean, it was a really key text. I mean, 1980s, saying that the criticism here was to the right rather than anything else. There's always this, in my view, a misconception that a lot of the art world are all lefty liberals. It's not the case. Yeah. We could ask around. I mean, you know, there's a certain beatnik aspect that can be associated, I think, with some sort of libertarian thinking that maybe it's actually some of the content of the script that's presented in the piece here kind of touches a little bit on that, about the perception of art as this entity and how it's taken on, you know, by the man on the street in a lot of cases. So anyway, I'm kind of moving on a lot into things, so yeah. Ah, super. Okay. Yeah. No. Well, if there's no more, I mean, we can also continue to talk. Yeah. Well, it depends. I'm also happy to. Yeah. Okay. So the work is 8 minutes long, and it's a video, and I can just play it. And maybe actually, it would be pleasant that I don't explain it, because it's a danger sometimes in these talks for me that I frame things again, about an entry point. It might seem forced or whatever, but it might actually be a really nice way to think about Duddy and that text, or that summation of the text in relation to this work. And this is a video was produced in 2006. The grammar or the language that's used in it, it was made by a local TV production crew, and the idea basically is so the grammar that's used is like an elongated news report in some way or other, and takes a very particular finding in the Irish landscape as its topic. I'm sorry, it's not playing. It's just there's a okay. Sorry.
For 23 years, I was working in Limerick, and twice a day, going from Crusheen to Limerick and Limerick back to Crusheen, I used to pass this place here. And at that time, in the 70s, 80s and 90s, there was no new road. The landscape was right up from the Fergus, open fields, and this place where I'm standing now was up on a height, I have to believe it now, and it was called Lynch's Crag. And at the top of that crag was this bush. what is now known as Latoon Fairy Bush. And I've had the story. I used to notice the bush, of course, every day because you couldn't but notice it. There it stood on its own up at the top of the crag, kind of a landmark, windswept kind of bush because of the wind up from the Fergus estuary. And I always thought there's something strange about that because it was a lone bush, and I always heard from old people, a lone bush, a shgach. Why is it alone? So I made inquiries. And a man over there, dead now, he finally told me the story about it. That this was no ordinary bush, indeed anything but. And he said that he had heard it from the old people before him, and he was a man in his late 70s when I knew him. He said that he had heard from the old people that this was a special bush in the sense that it was where, when the fairies of Munster would be fighting the fairies of Connacht, and remember, the Irish fairies are always fighting among each other, they're very belligerent, townland by townland, parish by parish, county by county, province by province. But the big battles, the important ones, like the ones between the provinces, when Munster fairies would be fighting the Connacht fairies, this was the bush that they'd gather around. And when they'd be all in, off they'd go off through the sky into Connacht to wherever the battle would be taking place that night, and they'd fight their battle, and as he said, sometimes they'd win, sometimes they'd lose, but no matter, win or lose, they'd have to come back here again to collect the number of them that were left. And now they'd be coming back and dragging their wounded and their dead with them, because remember, the fairies can kill each other. We can't kill them, but they can kill each other and wound each other. And when all of them that were coming in, that were returning, had come in, the leader, if he was still alive, he'd survey his troops for the night, and he'd say, right lads, home, and they'd scatter out into all the forts of Munster again. And the old man that told me the story, and this was the story that saved the bush in 1999 originally, from all the mist that you see going on around here now, within a radius of maybe 10 or 12 yards of this bush, he used to see on the ground, the grass had been shot that time because it was grazed by cattle, he used to see on the ground these lumps of stuff, as he called it, like liver. He said it had the consistency of liver. I remember him telling me that, except it was greenish. And immediately he'd know that on the night before the fairies had been fighting. Because, of course, they're not human, they haven't red blood, but their blood is greenish. So whatever the old man saw, and he was an unlettered man, an ordinary man, I'd say. He never went beyond primary school probably, but a very knowledgeable man. He kept his ears and his eyes open. He wasn't stupid anyway. And I noticed something going on here, at this very corner. And I wondered, yes, what's that? They were rooting. There was a big digger here, and they were rooting the surface. So I said, yes, I was in a hurry at the time into Limerick to get to school, but when I was coming home that evening, I stopped. And I got out, and I looked around, and one of the engineers with the hat came over to me, and I said to her, what's happening here? Now, it didn't click with me that, of course, this was the way that the Ennis bypass was coming. But for whatever reason, I said, are you building houses or something here? And no, she said, the road is coming up here. No, lovely woman she was, very obliging, talked to me and all the rest of it. No, she said, the road is coming up here. And I said to her, what's going to happen to the bush? And she said, what bush? I pointed it out to her. Look, there it is below there. We were up there at the time, above at the crossroads. And, she was very sympathetic, but you could see that the road was going to go ahead because they knew nothing about any bush. And for them, a bush is a bush. And I wrote into the Clare Champion, and then I contacted Clare FM, and Pat Kenny's show picked it up, and then the New York Times reporter in Dublin picked it up from the Pat Kenny show, and he came down here. I remember him well. Jim Clarity was his name. He was a big, stout man, but he came down, and he took notes, and he took photos of the bush. His photographer was with him and all that, but I knew very well he didn't believe me. Because, of course, he came for, a Paddy Leprechaun story, a quaint Irish story that you could have, for the Irish readership of the New York Times. But I told him, look, I'm only telling you what the old man above here told me. They put the road around it. Not around it. In fairness, they just landscaped it into the side of the road, as you see there. They just didn't interfere with it, which they could have, and they didn't. Now, here we are, 7 years later, and look where we are. And here is the bush, right in the track of a road coming up there behind it. Now, I don't know why, because there is one road, there is another monstrosity of a bank, like a railway embankment there on our left. And here is the bush, but behind it is what looks to me like a road being cut right up. And here it is, look at the tracks coming right outside the palisade. What are they going doing? You don't interfere with a fairy bush, you don't interfere with a fort, and you don't interfere with a fairy path, if you have any sense. And who wants to bring the lads and what they can do on yourself? Because what chance have you against them when you can't see them and they can see you? If this was demolished in the morning, everybody would say, oh Lord, wasn't it a terrible pity, and Lord, why didn't we do something? But meanwhile, the bush would be lying there going rotten. It'd be too late. And what I'd be afraid of, and this of course is the part that people would laugh at, what about the motorists that would have to pass here afterwards? What about them? This is not a bush that should be bulldozed lightly, just for the sake of a road. Just look, we'll always have roads. And the more roads we'll have, the faster we'll go. To get to where? To another traffic jam down the road, or to get to our bloody cafe to have our cappuccinos, or what? To talk nonsense with our friends, throw our mobile phones, blah, 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 blah. But you lose the stories that mean something, that can tell you something about life. We'll always be going someplace. And look, in the end of all, where do most people go? No place.
The good news is that the bush survived the onslaught of the 3 roads. You can still see it at junction 11. It's the Quinn turnoff beyond Shannon Airport. So we passed it the other day coming up to Sligo. The one thing I have noted on the site is extraordinary amount of blowouts in the last couple of burnt out tires or blown out tires in the last couple of months on the site. So every now and again I collect them because again in some way through the particular narrative that is being constructed through the video piece and whatnot, that these have some sort of significance.